What if I told you that aliens are real, but they're not extraterrestrial, they're actually interdimensional? Hear me out. To those of you who have never heard this before, I know this might sound crazy, but when the Bible talks about the end of the world, some interesting things come up. What if the whole alien phenomenon isn't extraterrestrial at all? What if these beings aren't even coming from another planet? What if they're spiritual beings? And what if the Bible has actually warned us about them for thousands of years? As Christians, we believe there's more to reality than just the physical world. Scripture tells us there's a spiritual realm operating alongside our own. In Ephesians 6:12, Paul himself writes, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." Think about that phrase, spiritual wickedness in high places. In other words, the real battle isn't just political, it's spiritual. Now fast forward to today. Governments around the world are openly acknowledging unidentified aerial phenomena, UAPs. Military pilots have been reporting objects that are doing a lot of crazy stuff. They accelerate instantly, they change direction in impossible ways, and they move without any visible propulsion at all. And what's the official explanation? It's still, we don't know what they are. While at the same time, governments classify enormous amounts of information. Entire intelligence agencies exist to control what the public knows and what it doesn't know. It's always been that way. So naturally, people are going to ask the question, do governments actually know more about these phenomena than they're telling us? I think, of course they do. And it wouldn't be the first time powerful institutions kept major secrets from the public, like the Epstein files. That's still happening. History is full of examples of that, not just through the Epstein stuff. And when you look at some of the scandals involving the powerful elites, again, like the Epstein case as the main example, it shows corruption can exist at the highest levels of power. It's always been that way. The Bible actually warns us that power structures in the world can be influenced by dark spiritual forces. Again, Ephesians says our struggle is not just against people. It's against spiritual powers behind the scenes. And speaking of the Bible, Genesis chapter 6 describes something incredibly strange. Genesis chapter 6 says, "The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took them as wives." Many early Jewish and Christian scholars believed that these sons of God were actually the fallen angels, spiritual beings crossing into the human world. And their offspring were called the Nephilim. I'm sure you guys have seen videos or heard about the Nephilim before. Then in 2 Corinthians 11:14, we're warned about something else. Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light. That means deception doesn't always look evil. Sometimes it appears beautiful, advanced, and even divine. And when you read Bible prophecy, one theme appears over and over: mass deception in the last days. Jesus himself said in Matthew 24, "False Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to deceive, if possible, even the elect." A deception so powerful it could fool almost everyone. Now think about the world we're living in right now. People are being told that non-human intelligences may exist. Scientists talk about other dimensions. Governments admit there are objects in our skies they can't explain. And the public is being slowly introduced to the idea of alien life, especially lately with Barack Obama coming out and talking about it, and then immediately after that, Trump talking about it. Now, I'm not claiming to know exactly what these phenomena are, of course, but as a Christian, I believe something really important. The Bible tells us the spiritual realm is real. It tells us fallen angels exist, and it tells us that Satan is the master of deception. So if there were ever going to be a big global deception, it might look exactly like something humanity has never seen before, something that convinces the world we're encountering advanced beings from another planet, when in reality, it could be something much older, something spiritual, something Scripture has warned about since the beginning. That's just my perspective as someone who believes the Bible, but it's something worth thinking about, because if Scripture is right, the greatest deception in human history could still be ahead of us. Now here's where things get even more serious, because the Bible doesn't just warn us that this deception exists. It tells us there'll be a time when deception becomes global. In 2 Thessalonians 2, the Apostle Paul talks about the rise of man, the man of lawlessness, often interpreted as the Antichrist. And listen careful to what he says. The coming of the lawless one will be in accordance with the work of Satan displayed in all kinds of counterfeit miracles, signs, and wonders. Counterfeit miracles, signs, and of course, all the crazy wonders. In other words, supernatural events that convince people something extraordinary is happening. But they are not from God. They're meant to deceive us. Then in Revelation 13, it describes another figure often called the false prophet. And it says this person will perform great signs, even calling fire down from heaven in front of people. And through those signs, he deceives the inhabitants of the earth. Think about that for a second. The entire world witnessing something supernatural and believing it. Project Bluebeam, kind of like that, but supernatural. Now imagine a scenario where humanity suddenly believes we're being contacted by advanced non-human beings. Beings that appear powerful. Beings that appear wise and way more advanced than us. And even claiming to guide humanity. Well, we're here to guide you. We're here to help you. We're here to help you get to the next level. If something like that happened, billions of people would believe it instantly. But Scripture warns that not every supernatural event comes from God. Some come from the spiritual forces that oppose him. So again, I'm not claiming to know exactly what UFO phenomena is. But as a Christian, I believe something important. The Bible tells us fallen angels exist. It tells us deception will increase in the last days, and it tells us Satan can disguise himself as something that appears good, powerful, and convincing. So the question isn't just, are aliens real? The real question might be, what if the world is being prepared to believe something that isn't what it appears to be? Because if the Bible is right, the greatest deception in human history may not come through politics or war. It'll come through something that appears supernatural, and billions of people may welcome it. Jesus himself said something very specific about the end times in Matthew 24:37. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. That's an interesting statement, because most people think about the days of Noah, they think about the flood. But the flood wasn't the problem. The flood was the judgment. The real problem was what was happening before the flood. Now let's think about it exactly what Jesus said. He didn't say the end times would be like Sodom. He didn't say the end times would be like Egypt. He specifically says, as it was in the days of Noah. So the question becomes, what exactly happened in the days of Noah? According to Genesis 6, spiritual beings interacted with humanity, widespread corruption of mankind, deception and wickedness increased across the earth. Now look at the world today. People are being introduced to the idea of non-human intelligences. Scientists talk about other dimensions. Governments acknowledge objects in our skies they can't explain. And at the same time, the Bible warns that in the last days there will be signs, wonders, and powerful deception. And in Genesis, they also tell us that that period involves supernatural beings interacting with humanity. And that's a big piece of this. So when the world starts talking about aliens, maybe the real question is, are we dealing with visitors from another planet? Or are we witnessing something the Bible already warned us about thousands of years ago? Because if the last days really do mirror the days of Noah, then humanity may be facing again the greatest spiritual deception in the history of mankind. And there's another ancient text that gets brought up a lot when people talk about Genesis chapter 6. It's called the Book of Enoch. Many people have never even heard of the Book of Enoch, but that's because it wasn't included in most modern Bibles. But here's what gets interesting when it comes to the Book of Enoch. In the ancient Jewish world, the Book of Enoch was actually very well known. In fact, the New Testament even references the Book of Enoch. The Book of Jude quotes directly from Enoch when it says, Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about them. So the early church was clearly familiar with the Book of Enoch. And it also expands on the Genesis 6 story. It describes a group of angels called the Watchers who descended to earth. And according to the text in the Book of Enoch, they began interacting with humanity and teaching people things they were never supposed to teach. Things like advanced weapons, metalwork, astrology, and occult knowledge. The text says this knowledge corrupted humanity and contributed to the chaos that eventually led to the flood. Now, the obvious question people ask, is the Book of Enoch real? Should it have been in the Bible? If it's so well known, why is it not in the Bible? So there's a couple reasons, in my opinion. First, the Jewish leaders who finalized the Hebrew canon, they didn't include it among the official scriptures. Later on, when the Christian Bible canon was being formalized, most church leaders followed the same list of Old Testament books. Another reason is that the Book of Enoch was written later than many of the Old Testament texts, and scholars debated exactly how historically reliable it was. So over time, it was treated as a part of ancient religious text, but not part of the official canon. But one interesting detail is that the Book of Enoch is still included in the Bible of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which is one of the oldest Christian traditions in the world. So even though most Christians today have never read it, the text has actually been around for over 2,000 years. The idea that Genesis chapter 6 involved fallen angels interacting with humanity wasn't just some fringe theory either. It was actually taught by several Christian leaders in the first few centuries of the church. These men lived much closer to the time of the apostles than we do today, of course. And one of them was Justin Martyr, who lived in the 2nd century. He wrote that certain angels fell from heaven and began interacting with humanity. According to him, these fallen angels influenced mankind and helped spread corruption throughout the world. Another early Christian writer named Irenaeus, I think I'm saying that right, also talked about this. He wrote that angels who fell from heaven taught humans things they were never supposed to teach, things that led humanity away from God. Then there was a Tertullian, another early church thinker. He actually defended the Book of Enoch and said the story about angels descending to earth lined up with what Genesis described. Now again, this doesn't prove every detail in Enoch is true, but it does show that ancient Jewish and early Christian thinkers were already wrestling with the idea that supernatural beings did indeed interact with humanity in the ancient world. Maybe some of this could explain the pyramids in Egypt. I'm just throwing that out there. So what brings us back to Genesis and the days of Noah? Here's something that most people don't realize. Some of the people who studied this phenomena the closest, now scientists, intelligence officials, defense personnel, have actually said things that make this mystery even more strange. For example, former intelligence officer Lou Elizondo, who ran the Pentagon's Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, has said publicly that we may be dealing with something that isn't simply technology from another country. In interviews, he suggested that the phenomena may involve something that challenges our understanding of reality itself. In other words, something obviously beyond just aircraft. There was another researcher who spent decades studying this, and that's Jacques Vallée. He worked with astronomers, computer scientists, and even NASA projects. After years of investigating UFO encounters, he reached a pretty surprising conclusion. He said the phenomena behaves less like visitors traveling across space and more like intelligence interacting with humanity from another level of reality. Something that may exist alongside our world, rather than somewhere far away in the universe. And then there's a statement from former Canadian Defense Minister Paul Hellyer, who once suggested humanity should seriously consider the possibility that non-human intelligences might already be interacting with Earth. Again, this doesn't prove anything, but when government officials and researchers start saying stuff like this, it raises questions. What exactly are we dealing with? I do want to say something else for the Christians who are watching. There's a popular, and some of you might not like this at all, you might be very mad about this, about what I'm about to say. There's a popular teaching, and there's been movies written about it, where believers think they're going to be raptured before the tribulation actually begins. But here's the problem. Many theologians argue that when you read Scripture carefully, that interpretation is not as clear as people think. For example, and this is the main one for me, in Matthew 24, Jesus described the timeline of the end times themselves. And listen to what he says. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect. That sounds like the gathering of believers happens after the tribulation, not before it. Then you look at 2 Thessalonians 2. Paul says, that day will not come unless the rebellion occurs and the man of lawlessness is revealed. He's talking about the Antichrist. And if the rapture happens before the tribulation, how could the man of lawlessness, the Antichrist, be revealed? It doesn't make sense. In other words, certain end-time events happen before the gathering of believers. And in Revelation 20, it describes believers who endured the tribulation and remained faithful. So that, to me, suggests Christians may still be present during the tribulation. But this point isn't to argue with other believers. It's not what it's about. But it is important that Christians stay grounded in Scripture to what it actually says. Because if people believe they'll never face hardship or persecution during the tribulation, and then it happens, so many of them are going to struggle with their faith. You know, Jesus repeatedly told his followers to endure and remain faithful no matter what happens. So we need to stay watchful and you have to stay grounded in Scripture. Don't let anyone deceive you. And remember, people will quote scriptures that seem to say the rapture will happen before the tribulation, but when those scriptures directly contradict the words of Jesus himself in Matthew, that should be a clear indication they are not being interpreted correctly. Do not lose your faith. This theory of the rapture before tribulation really didn't become mainstream until 1830. Not that other people before that weren't talking about it at all, but it really didn't become a thing until around 1830. This probably won't be the last time I talk about this subject. I think that within the framework of the Bible and Christianity and everything that's happening in the world, we need to be prepared. Yes, we have faith, but we're still called to provide provisions for ourselves, for our families, to help the innocent, and to be ready for hard times. So yeah, you have faith, but you also need to be prepared. You need to use your brain. God gave us a brain for a reason. Stay strong, keep training, and we'll see you next time.